Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I know it's the last day of the conference, but I think we'll have a really interesting conversation today. I'm Paige Nickel. I'm the director in Europe for Bluemark. Bluemark's a leading impact verification provider. We work with a wide range of investors to assess both their impact management practices as well as the way that they do impact performance reporting. And that's what we'll be talking about on the panel today. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our great group of panelists. If you wouldn't mind putting the speaker slide up, that would be great. We have Veronica Giusti-Keller from Blue Orchard. She's the head of impact there. We have Stefan Lugensmann from LGT Capital Partners, and we have Antonia Seriska from UBS. Without further ado, would you guys mind just introducing yourselves and kind of telling the group a little bit about your impact strategies?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me well? Yes. So I come from Blue Orchard, thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here. So we are a global impact fund manager. We specialized in investments in emerging and frontier markets. We manage funds on various impact themes. We started over 20 years ago with microfinance investments, but then we expanded to education finance, climate finance, and also we started with one asset class, but we're now covering private debt, private equity, and also public debt. So that's been an interesting evolution. And I'm the head of impact management at Blue Orchard. Our role and the team's role is to oversee the sustainability and impact of the funds that we manage. And we are also an independent team that also reviews and assesses the impact and the ESG risks for all the investments that we do.
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Stefan Lugensmann. Warm welcome also from my side, and thanks Paige and the Bluemark team for having me. I work as an impact and ESG specialist at LGT Capital Partners, which is a global asset manager. We started our first impact fund last year, 2021, and it's focused on 3 broad impact themes: climate change, healthcare, and inclusive growth, mainly focusing on developed markets. And our strategy is to invest as a minority co-investor, but also we invest in primary funds with dedicated impact managers. So our position in the value chain is a bit different than the other panelists, and but we leverage also the broad experience from the LGT ecosystem with LGT Venture Philanthropy, which has been active in impact investing for quite a while, and also our sister company, Lightrock, which are based in London, and more direct impact GP. And it's quite useful collaboration, fruitful, and yeah, we can really leverage this whole ecosystem that exists in LGT.
Thanks, Paige, and thanks, team, for having us as well. My name is Antonia Sarisca. I'm part of UBS on the global wealth management side. As a global wealth manager, we oversee around $3.5 trillion of assets, and we are also advising our clients, that's private clients and family offices predominantly, on how to select, diligence, and ultimately invest in impact investing strategies. So that means we're an open architecture platform. We'll mostly work with asset managers from across the world in terms of sourcing and identifying what will be, in our view, the most impactful solutions. We've been doing that for about 10, 12 years now. Started with private markets, mostly venture capital and growth equity. In the recent years, we've also moved into shareholder and bondholder engagement across public markets as well. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you all very much. So as you see, we have a great range of different impact strategies and asset classes represented here, which I think will make for a fruitful conversation about impact reporting. Before we open up the conversation, I wanted to do a bit of framing just to share a perspective that Bluemark's been developing around some of the challenges and opportunities to make impact performance reporting stronger for investors. And something to note as we have this conversation is, as you can see from the panelists here, what we're talking about is really reporting by investors. So it's about thinking about the aggregated reporting. And of course, there are a lot of challenges from the portfolio level kind of company impact reporting. So I think we'll touch on that today, but we're really talking about impact performance reporting by investors. And as we set out as Bluemark to think about how we could be useful in this space, we actually did some grant-funded research over the last year with support from the Tipping Point Fund and Rockefeller Foundation to assess the state of the market. So we interviewed a wide variety of stakeholders, both GPs and LPs, about what good impact reports look like. We also reviewed over 60 reports. And through that process, it became clear, I think, something that's probably obvious to you all already, which is that although we have started to see convergence around standards for impact management practice, so things like the operating principles for impact management, the IMP guidelines, et cetera, SDG Impact, there aren't standards like that about impact performance reporting yet, what should be in a high quality report. And so as Bluemark went through this research, we were able to, we were actually kind of pleasantly surprised to find that there was more convergence around what are the common elements of a quality impact report. And so I'll share those now. So this slide summarizes at a high level the findings from this report that's called Raising the Bar. You're welcome to find it online. There's a lot more detail there about what we learned. But there are really 5 key elements of quality impact reports that Bluemark thinks that all investors should include. And you'll see them here. So it's everything from being very clear up front about what you're trying to achieve, what your impact goals are, setting ex-ante targets, and measuring and reporting on them, all the way through to thinking about things like being transparent about lessons learned, what didn't go well, potentially unintended consequences, both positive and negative. And this point on integrated stakeholder perspectives, I think, is really important and one that we really don't see very commonly across impact performance reports yet, although it's increasingly something that I know investors are paying more attention to. So this is kind of I hope, a helpful basis for the conversation that we're going to have today. And, you know, I think we'll hear from this group about what they make of these quality elements and which parts are easier and harder to actually address. I think when we think about what confidence the market is really looking for from impact reports, we're going to need more than just this list, right, of good elements. I think the market really needs more examples of what good reports look like, as well as kind of practical guidance and even verification. And that's something we'll talk a little bit about, but just the independent assurance that what's being reported is not only accurate, audits of data accuracy are increasingly common, but also complete and telling a story that's meaningful and useful to both the asset manager and potentially to asset owners and other stakeholders as well. So with that, I'd like to just open it up to the panel for discussion. And I think maybe as a starting point, it would just be helpful to hear each of you share some of your reflections on some of the greatest challenges that you've seen, experienced yourselves or seen in the market in terms of what makes impact performance reporting harder than it might seem.
Should I start?
Yeah, sure. Veronica, go ahead.
I start this time. Well, first of all, I think from our experience, we have seen a huge increase in the demands from investors on reporting. I think overall this is very positive because we are seeing investors are more engaged and are asking more questions and are also asking smarter questions, and it's something that I think it's very welcome. That's on the one side. On the other hand, though, I mean, it is also a challenge for us because we work with different types of investors. So we work with investors that specialize and are very knowledgeable about impact and have a very thorough, long list of requests on reporting, but also now more and more the sort of more commercial type of investors are coming up with us with very long lists of demands. And as everything in life, I think we need to find the right balance. Of course, these information requests, it's costly, it takes time. This information also, these requests we need to collect from the investees. And it's a lot of effort that goes behind. So I think something, for example, that is very important for us is that whatever we collect, you have to assess, and you need to use this information, in the investment decisions. So whatever we request, it needs to be used. And I think this is something also that we want investors to do. You request a long list, and we hope that then we start the discussion, and then decisions are made, and that this information is used. And for us, I think we've also been evolving. We at Blue Orchard, we measure impact mainly with two tools. One is the an ESG assessment that goes hand in hand with a thorough ESG questionnaire. This questionnaire, and we started with a super long list. We're now shortening it, just exactly this. It's a burden to our investees to fill in a 20-page questionnaire. So we need to find, okay, what is really material for this specific industry, what are the material risks, and also spend time and pick just what is really for us a concern, and spend the time doing that instead of just ticking boxes, I would say, exercise. And the same we have also an impact scorecard that focuses more on the KPIs, on how we are measuring impact, and this is mostly data points that gets reported back to us on a quarterly basis. And again, it takes time and effort, not only for our investees, but also at Blue Orchard. We need to review, we need to assess what happened. So I think it's really finding the balance between what you're asking and also what you are asking, if it's really meaningful for what you are trying to achieve.
Great, thank you. So Stefan, I don't know if you'd like to add any additional challenges beyond, of course, cost, burden to investees.
Sure, yeah, happy to. And also just echoing what you said, I mean, a lot of what you said applies to us, of course, as well. And all the 5 key elements that are listed here bring a lot of challenges for us, but maybe one of the biggest challenges is to resist this temptation to boil everything down in just metrics and aggregate and come up with funny numbers, especially since we have a very diversified impact fund with 3 different broad themes. I mean, we can't just come up with 2, 3 KPIs and say this is what we achieved, right? It doesn't make sense. Sometimes we see funny numbers in reports that just don't make sense. And so for us, I would say it's a bit this balance of having the right KPIs and measure progress over time against predefined targets, but also having the qualitative context, because our investments are very different from each other. Each individual investment is very different, and we need to have this context about geography, about target groups, beneficiaries, industries. Without this, all the numbers are not meaningful for the reader to interpret. So finding this balance, also we have restricted space usually in a report, right? You can't write 10 pages on each investment, so how do you boil it down, have the KPIs, but still add the qualitative color that enables investors to base their decisions on it. That's maybe the biggest one for us.
Great, thanks. Antonia, do you want to add challenges?
Sure, maybe I'll pick up on the last thing that Stefan mentioned. And I guess for us as a wealth manager, the added complexity comes from the fact that each different client that we have or investor we have investing in impact investing strategies might be invested in different ones at the same time, right? So almost every single portfolio has a different composition of funds underneath, which means that aggregating on a portfolio level becomes a very fragmented type of job. And in many cases, it won't even be, going back to what Stefan mentioned, wouldn't even be as relevant because you're dealing with very different themes that target very different objectives. So how do you come up with a set of unified KPIs to be able to articulate that? So I think that continues to be a challenge. I would say there are a couple of things that we've personally observed over time where we think impact managers are really getting very good at, and that's tremendous help for those of us who have to now educate private investors, especially on what it means to measure impact or report on impact. And I think probably the first one is, and Veronica briefly mentioned that, is this delineation between ESG metrics and impact metrics, and what do they really mean, and what is material and what is not. And I think what we see increasingly is that, yes, pretty much most of the fund managers that we will come across would measure, let's say, diversity share in the management teams of their portfolio companies. Of course, we would argue that is an excellent ESG metric and that is very relevant to each and every business, but that is a very different type of metric and an impact than what we would have seen from the products and services of that company. And I think managers are increasingly getting better at articulating what they mean when they say, here is the ESG performance and here is the impact performance. I guess the second one I'll point out is the lessons learned part. So for us as we are also thinking about our own investor additionality. When you're so far off from portfolio companies, you ask yourself, how am I being additional as an investor? And I guess one of the ways we try to do that is essentially by having conversations with fund managers in terms of, here's things we hear from private investors, and here's the things we think they find important or they tell us they find important. I think lessons learned has been one of those topics. So in the past few years, we have seen really tremendous improvement in the quality of the reports we have seen, all because of that reiterative process of having conversations with investors, understanding what narrative makes sense, what story makes sense, what people understand, what is the key message that they're left with, and then as a result, making those reports even better.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that last point is something that we're often looking for both in impact reporting and also in impact management practices. I think that, having a structure in place to reflect on, what did you try to do? What did you think was going to happen? What surprised you? And therefore, what are you going to do differently next time? It's good to hear that the asset allocators are looking for that that kind of cycle as well. So great. So it would be great to hear a little bit more. I think you all have already touched on some of the challenges that are specific to your places in the market. It would be helpful to hear a little bit more in detail, maybe any benefits and or challenges that you see given the kind of role you play. So when we're looking at more direct private markets investments versus a fund-to-fund strategy versus a wealth manager, do you want to elaborate on that? Maybe, Antonia, you could kick us off this time.
Sure, maybe I'll start with one of the things I alluded to, which is that as an asset allocator, you end up with many different portfolios with a lot of different content. So I have to say, we have tried several times to come up with a portfolio aggregation in terms of impact metrics, and we were not successful. Of course, that is different if we try to do it for us as a wealth manager. That will probably be more possible. But every time we try to articulate to a client what is your specific impact across your specific portfolio, given the fund ownership and the themes that you're addressing, then that becomes a very difficult role. I think the other key challenge, and again, here is where partnership with fund managers and their transparency is so important, is that we as an asset allocator have virtually very little control over what's happening in those funds and portfolios, right? It's the prerogative of the fund managers in terms of how they select investments, how they engage with those investee companies, and ultimately how they drive impact. But it does give us a degree of comfort or ability to articulate why impact investing matters and why it's important for private investors to hold impact investments. When we have that continuous communication with the fund managers and we are able to essentially have them engage with our own investors at times and explain what is it that they do as part of impact reporting, as part of impact management. And I think that collaboration has become increasingly intensified, right? So, I think wealth managers, when it comes to sustainable impact investing, are no longer, just a distributor, for the lack of a better word. I think they're now partnering that investor education. I think they're really trying to bring those messages across and ultimately tap into the massive scale they have behind them in terms of trying to mobilize more capital for the funds. So maybe I'll highlight that as maybe our particular role in the value chain.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask Veronica if you want to respond just kind of as a fund manager on the other side and how you think about the relationship with investors and their demands when it comes to impact reporting.
Yeah, no, again, as I said at the beginning, I think we are much closer to them, and I think the interest on our results, on how we do things, has increased, which we see, again, very positive. On the other hand, we see as well that there are different approaches on what we are demanded to provide. No? So if we manage various of our funds come from development finance organizations, and they have very, very strict reporting requirements that we have to produce. In a way, I think this has, for Blue Orchard, we have now standardized somehow this part. I think we are good. But on the others, I think also there's a very different level of understanding on the more commercial investors on what they want to see. And so I think there is also a lot of education when we explain and when we report the figures, and you mentioned this before, the context. And I think it's important not just when you report your results, that you explain how you have collected these, what it entails, and also explain what it means, because oftentimes we get a lot of questions of our quarterly reports, etc. That it's so much better to have explained in meetings. So something that we are now doing, for example, is open calls, for example, with investors, where we cover, yes, the financial side, but many, more and more, we're also covering issues and hot topics. Sometimes, there are questions regarding microfinance, for example, and we have to explain how much or what is our process, for example, for selecting, how much we care about the S part on the ESG, how are we, really trying to make this in a very responsible way. And then it gives them comfort. I think it is on our best interest to increase transparency, I would say, if we want to scale up impact investing. So I think the more education that we do on what is material for them to listen to, I think it's going to be better for all of us.
Great. And Stefan, sorry for jumping in a minute ago.
No problem. I think our position or challenge is closer to what Antonia has been describing, because we're further removed from the portfolio companies. We rely a lot on the managers, the quality of the reporting, the type of metrics that they collect, etc. And especially in our case, it's maybe even more difficult because we also invest from our impact fund with conventional managers. They don't necessarily think about impact, but we see that they do impactful businesses and then go together with them. And I think this is super important because we cannot afford, if you really want to scale this, we cannot afford to only invest with the kind of well-known typical impact GPs, right? We really want to broaden this field, and we see it as an important part of our investor contribution to engage with these also conventional managers and make them more familiar with the IMM practices, impact measurement and management practices. And it's really quite a fruitful collaboration, but also, to be honest, it doesn't work well with all of them from the beginning, right? Sometimes in the beginning they're resistant, they don't understand what we're asking for, they need to build up their systems and the capabilities internally. But I think because of our position in the value chain, this is what we can do and where we have a role in this, no?
If I may add just one thing, because it's yes, we do are in much closer contact with our investees directly, which is a great advantage. But we follow more or less, it's funny, the same process, because we also have to demand them to have, these minimum standards, for example, on a code of conduct, and responsible lending if it's microfinance, or environmental practices if it's a sustainable infrastructure impact theme, and our process is quite similar. We also, oftentimes we have to engage and educate them on what is important for them to measure, for us and for them to demonstrate the impact they are making or the negative impact they are not. No, I mean, we are now, for example, and since we work in emerging and developing countries, I mean, the carbon footprint is a very clear example, and we are engaging with many of our investees on explaining, first of all, what this is all about. I mean, and also basic definitions. We've been working towards as well educating, and on our ESG questionnaire comes as well with a set of definitions, because it's not a priority for many of these. If this is not your theme and the core business that you have, you are not doing that. And for us, it's important. I think it's important for us as Blue Orchard because it will define how we will engage and where we will prioritize. We all want to be in net zero, for example, but this needs to start with measuring these KPIs. And it's a process it's educational, and we share the concern, and we share with our investees, and we engage with them on how to improve their reporting to us, because this allows us as well to report back to other stakeholders, no?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I mean, an interesting takeaway already of this conversation is just how many dependencies there are among different actors in the value chain for quality impact reporting. So I think that actually points to this question of standards. So I'll turn to that next. So from Bluemark's perspective, it would be very helpful to all those different actors in the value chain if there was more kind of common standards and expectations around what impact reporting should look like, taking some of the burden of education off of individual managers, perhaps. But I'm curious to hear your all's reactions more specifically to the elements of quality impact reports that we've put forward. This is very much something up for debate. It's new, and would love to hear your pushback or questions, concerns around how realistic including all 5 of these elements is in your experience.
Maybe I can give it a go.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. I do think all 5 of them are quite relevant. Maybe one thing I would caveat is that As much as we would like to go towards standardization, I fully resonate with some of the concerns here that if you have 10 different investors demanding a different type of report, at some point you go bananas, for lack of a better word, because you have to produce all of these very fragmented reports, essentially containing very same content, because it's not like you're changing measurement down the road or engagement. So I think standardization definitely helps with that, will help us tremendous lot. Maybe one thing I would still keep in mind is that impact reporting still needs to be very conscious of what is the specific strategy that we're addressing. And maybe I'll start with a very obvious one, like asset class. So what in terms of, I think the 5 elements should still be there in every report. I would just think about how they actually are proliferate, or how they come across in the actual report. So if I think of, let's say, a early stage venture capital strategy where metrics are very much focused on something that will probably be realized in 10, 15 years from now, and it's probably still a little bit more theoretical in nature. Let's say you're financing biotech therapies out of a research lab, right? I mean, that's a very typical one where you would ask yourself, 20 years from now, I will know where the quality of life of these patients has improved. Like you won't know before that. So I think as investors, we need to be very cautious of the fact that sometimes these reports will just be very much asset class specific. A shareholder engagement strategy in public markets will have very different set of metrics. The theory of change would look very differently. So again, I would caution again, I'd love standardization in terms of what type of content we're addressing. I would still be careful about what the actual metrics, theory of change, what the actual details of that strategy would be. And I would still like it to be very much strategy specific in that regard.
Makes a lot of sense. Veronica, do you want to add?
Sure. I think standardization is very common and is really the new trend. Somehow it's standardization of, we have the operating principles for impact management that, set some standards that you need to have. And I would say it's also helpful to have sort of some principles as well for what a good impact report should look. I think with the more educated investors that we have, and when they just see a 2-page with just a couple of cherry-picked case studies, I mean, this is not going to be enough, and that's good again for the industry and impact investing overall. Also in Europe, we're seeing this mega trend on standardizing as well. I mean, we have the SFDR regulation, and I will not go into too much details. There are many things there that perhaps I would have done differently. But one thing that is quite useful is that it is setting up, when you set up an impact strategy, you need to really elaborate from the beginning what you are trying to do, what is the strategy on how you will try to address this problem that you're trying to face, and how you will measure it. And then, on an annual basis, all of these sort of strategies that are intended to do impact will have to at least address these points. And I think it's a start, we've been doing this for a long time, but we are seeing, we want to avoid impact washing, and I think this is sort of a start. It's a standard that at least in Europe is just, okay, we are starting from this baseline. No? Now, again, any standardization will have difficulties. No? I think you may avoid, touching upon a certain topic that is very important. No? How you elaborate, again, negative impact is, addressed under the regulation with a set of KPIs that are completely meaningless in some strategies. And there are some that are very material that are not there. So I think, again, it's important to understand and address what, the meaningful message, and also that you walk the talk. No? So that's, I think, at the end of the day, what we want to see.
Great. Thanks. Stefan?
I agree with your last point about adverse impacts, and I think that's one element, the last one, transparency into risk and lessons learned, that's super helpful also for us internally, because it almost gives us like the license to include this kind of information in a report. And I think it's key because nobody in the whole chain has enough incentives to talk openly about negative impacts, about impact risks. starting with the portfolio companies, with our GPs, with ourselves. So I think this, particularly the last point here on the list, is super important. And it's not just, again, back to my first point, it's not just about quantifying the PAIs or something like that, but it's also about describing what could go wrong, where do we have a negative impact, being transparent about it. And frankly, based on this, we forced ourselves to include a section in our report for every co-investment just to talk about risks, what could go wrong, maybe which portion of the asset is not yet really aligned with what we want to achieve, because it's hardly, most cases are not black and white in impact. That's how I see it. There's a lot of gray. So sometimes we just have companies that, make 80% of their revenue with really impactful stuff and 20% with maybe not so impactful things. And we want to be open about it and transparent. One example is we did an investment with in a US company. They're a provider of tech-enabled building management solutions. So they basically help bring down energy consumption, emissions in commercially used buildings. And real estate, the building sector, is one of the main drivers of emissions. So these solutions make 80% of the revenue highly impactful. The other 20%, energy procurement for clients. The main goal is to achieve low cost. Not all of the energy they procure is renewable. They procure natural gas, non-renewable electricity. It's part of the business. So we had big debates internally. Is this enough? Is it not enough? How do we deal with the pros and cons? And we decided in the end to do it, also because both the manager and the management of the company, they were very committed to advancing this transition, to increase the share of renewables in the procured energy mix. So we decided to do the investment, but we also openly talk about this in our report. And I think that's something that is supported by such a framework, because it helps us internally when the report goes up the ladder, to say, look, we need to do this because it's the standard. Maybe otherwise, someone in the firm would come and say, yeah, but we can't include this, what will our investors think about it? But I think it actually adds credibility, because as you said, investors are not stupid. They're very knowledgeable, and they realize if you want to fool them, so to say. So, yeah. In that sense, it helps us a lot. Sorry for the convoluted answer, but...
Looking forward to Antonia's response in this one. Thank you.
No, I love that we came to that topic, actually, so thank you for that. I think the risk to impact, right? That is such a critical topic, and I fully agree with Stefan. I think for me, and my daily job is impact due diligence of funds. That's literally what I and other people in our team would do, is they would look at those reports and the investment process of that manager and just think about, okay, does this make sense? Does this sound credible to us, right? And I think not thinking about the risk to impact is definitely a red flag in anybody's book, right? Up to a point where, if I think of when we ask a manager in terms of, what is your original kind of investment selection process, and how are you quantifying or even assessing the risk to impact? One of the most common answers we hear is, well, it's called linearity, right? I mean, the products and services of that company are inherently impactful. As the company grows, the impact will grow. And I don't disagree. I think nobody disagrees with that. That's the whole premise of impact investing. But if you work with a manager that says that and says, therefore, there is no risk to impact, that's where things start getting tricky, and that's a massive red flag. Because, of course, we all know business models change down the road. There are things we cannot foresee. There is something that will be at risk. And I think being very open about it up front, and then 2 years from now, reflecting back on that in the impact report, is how things should be treated. So to any fund manager that has an issue of communicating that internally, I would say I think that is becoming definitely a must-have for most investors to see in an impact report.
And it's very important as well to identify these risks in advance of making an investment ourselves as impact fund managers, because it also allows you to mitigate these risks. So we do, and this impact scorecard that I mentioned before, I mean, the final section is specifies, all the potential impact risks, and you need to make an evaluation. And oftentimes then, this is in a discussion. If the risks are too high, you have a discussion with the investment committee, you have a discussion with the legal team, and then you put, nothing really will guarantee anything, of course, but you are better protected, and you could add, clauses in the loan agreements, for example, with the end clients to say, okay, if this doesn't go in the right direction, you can, you have some leverage to act upon it. Clearly, the first instance would always be engagement, but it's very important to consider these impact risks, before you make an investment, then to be able to have a strategy and mitigate these risks as you would on any other risk. If you make an investment, you put clauses and covenants on ROA, for example. So we do the same with the impact side, no?
Yeah, it's such an important point, and I just want to reiterate, this is advanced practice that we're talking about. I mean, just from the experience of looking at impact management systems, the Impact Management Project has the 5 dimensions of impact that some of you may be familiar with. That's a great resource for thinking about risk. One of the dimensions is risk, and they get into kind of 6 types. But in the systems that we look at, I think it's not super common still that managers are really thoughtfully thinking about impact risk ex ante. And that does then make it more difficult to do the kind of reporting that you're talking about. So it's fantastic that you guys are doing it, and I would kind of urge others to look into those resources and think about starting. All right, so last question I have before, and we'll open it up to audience questions, is about this question of verification for impact reports. So of course that's what Bluemark does, but we're hopeful that there's a broader market out there where you can't be the only ones doing this. And there's a question of, do you have just data points assured, perhaps by an auditor, versus have some kind of other approach to verification? I'm curious to hear your all's reactions to, is the market ready for this? How funds think about shouldering those costs, et cetera. So who wants to kick us off?
So we definitely see the value of having an external party, looking at your results, looking at your processes. We have been externally verified for our impact management process, and then we learned a lot, and it was a very good opportunity to discuss, with external parties how we are doing things, and how the market is doing this. So there is a value in that. Also for in Blue Orchard, I mean, we have already worked with external parties, and not necessarily on a verification, but we have worked, and hired consultants to build our report. And there is value in this clearly, because one thing is that we say that we are so impactful, and then something else is that you have an independent party saying that for you, no? Our experience was a bit mixed in this sense. We expected perhaps less intervention, and we ended up working a lot, because in the end we know our product so well. It's a lot of work to produce these reports as well. I mean, it's something about the balance I was mentioning at the beginning. You need to think, I mean, we all have limited resources, I mean, our investees as well, and we had to organize so many meetings that our investees, had to attend with these consultants. So, I mean, I think we need to get better at that as well. But I think investors, would see the value of having, a third party assessing that. Another way we have been using already for the last few years, maybe I would say 4 to 5 years, is to also hear directly from our end beneficiaries, no? Because we do invest in, for example, in financial institutions to provide, climate insurance to the poor and vulnerable, if I think of one example. But we want to hear from the people, the end borrowers, if they are finding this beneficial. And for that, we have hired as well, external parties to conduct surveys to them. And I think this is also, that has been very useful to us. It's not us saying or, at all manipulating the results. So we're getting this external party to do that for us. And it has been very useful. It also helps us, learn from what is missing. A lot of things came out of this exercise. And new trainings and new technical assistance that we can provide. So these are things, because for us, the impact reports is for our investors, but it's also an opportunity to see how you are doing and where you can do things better. So I think in that there's a lot of value. Yeah.
Yeah, I can only echo that. Also for us, we went through a report verification process with Bluemark in the beginning of this year for our first impact report, which was, by the way, only sent to investors. So it was not a marketing report or so. It was only available for really our LPs. I also found the process beneficial in two ways. First, the report itself got more consistent, more complete. We found a better balance. You really pushed us to include these risks there, to talk about the negative impacts, etc., etc. But also, as Veronica said, it's not just about the report. At the end of the day, by going through these processes or this verification process, you also, I called it before a group therapy, internal group therapy, because you have to be reflecting on what you do, why you do it, what you don't do, what you could be doing more in the future. So it's also just a great way to improve. And at the end of the process, we had a roadmap with very clear points that we can do in the future. And I have to say, I'm kind of proud of our first report. We're doing okay on all the 5 elements, but clearly we have room for improvement in all the elements, and that was a great outcome for us. Is the market ready? I'm not sure, Paige, you probably know better than us. You have a better overview. One question probably for us is about scalability. Because as Veronica said, it takes resources, it's costly. The question is, who bears the cost? Is it a fund cost? Does it go up in a linear fashion when you have more fund reports that you want to verify? Or is there some scale effects that you get at some point? Maybe that's a topic you can elaborate on. Sorry to put you on the spot, but we have only done one so far, so let's see how it develops in the future.
Yeah, sure. And I think I'll probably agree with both of you in a sense that one thing we're as an asset allocator, we're not prescriptive to the managers that we work with in terms of you need to have an externally verified impact report. But one observation is that increasingly what we see is managers working with an advisor, an external advisor, on how they're thinking about reporting, how they're thinking about measurement more broadly. And I guess, Paige, back to your question, I would genuinely draw that line, and we had that brief chat before the panel, but I would draw that line between working with an advisor or an external consultant in terms of clarity and completeness and what it means to have a good report and how to organize yourself and your capabilities and what are the resources you need to have, versus literally a data quality assurance report where somebody goes and goes through your impact measurement data and just make sure that that's being collected in the right way and the formulas are all right and the data quality is good. So I would maybe distinguish between these two, and I think probably the second one is something that would likely be more commodified. So my expectation will be that down the line, similar to how we have with financial audit, there will be a range of firms and also a range of fund managers that will be relying on someone like that to put a rubber stamp underneath measurement and say, this data is of good quality and this metrics make sense. But I think on the other one where we're talking about more advisory, more like context, more clarity and completeness like we see on the slide, I think that one is probably still a learning curve for many managers. I think it is best practice that we see that they do work with an external advisor like that. And I hope that will continue, because it definitely makes for better impact reports. Like you see it actually when you see those reports evolve. The question on costs, I think, is a very interesting one. And I would draw a parallel to impact measurement, which, you know, in the past, what we would have seen is that an impact fund, especially in private markets, will tend to have a higher management fee or a higher carry contribution fee in some cases, because of that issue of we now need to set up a whole new impact measurement system with our portfolio companies, and that is an undertaking that takes costs. Now, 10 years down the line, we see that occurring less and less because a lot of the managers have internalized a lot of those costs, and that starts to be kind of a minimum basic requirement for impact strategies anyway. So if you as an impact manager are not doing that, again, red flag. Verification, I wonder whether that's going to go the same way in terms of, you know, fund managers will be looking to probably think about, okay, this is an extra cost now that I still need to internalize, but it's going to take some time. So how do I finance that external cost? Will that come from the end investor? Will that come from some kind of a collaborative financing from somewhere, technical assistance, you name it? And I think that will be an open question, but I would just maybe draw a parallel to what happened with impact measurement 10 years ago. And I probably see a similar evolution.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I mean, just to say, we currently see a mix of where the costs are born. I think for impact management practice verifications in particular, we're a little bit ahead, I think because the standards are a little bit ahead. And so we see cases where allocators might have a relationship with us to do multiple verifications of their underlying fund managers, and also cases where the fund manager is coming to us directly because they see it as an opportunity to present themselves as a more credible impact manager to their investors. So it's sort of both sides right now, but on reporting, it's time will tell. I'm not sure. Great. Well, love to open it up and see if there are audience questions. If you do have a question, you can just press the button in the middle of your microphone and it'll light up so I can call on you. Yeah.
Hello, Giacomo Moroni from Robico. We speak about impact a lot, but you have never mentioned SDGs. I don't know if you're using the SDGs to report impact. Yeah, maybe let's start with this one. Yeah.
I start briefly. I mean, yes, SDGs, it's another framework to report back your results. And so in Blue Orchard, we started before the SDGs. That's, I think, started in 2015, so we had KPIs before. What we have done, and what's important, I think, when you are reporting SDGs, is not just to put the very colorful SDGs, but also to map and quantify how you are contributing towards these SDGs. And what we try to do is to do this, bottom up. So all the information we collect directly from our investees, just to measure this up, we try to aggregate to the different SDGs. And also something important, and again, going back to the concept of impact investing, is not just by coincidence, okay, you have this number of women, so I don't know, you claim SDG 5. I think the way we claim our SDGs is really connected to the impact intent of a certain activity. So if, you are working with financial inclusion or climate adaptation that we have, we select these SDGs and the KPIs that go, that have been mapped against them at the beginning of the strategy. And this is what we are measuring. So we have, what's the core intent, and then there are other SDGs that relate to sort of ESG standards, for example, because we also demand, of course, just not to have negative impact as well, to have our investees must have also, strong ESG standards that could also, correlate with SDG 8 on, fair treatment for your employees, etc. But I think the SDGs that you claim must be linked to the strategy, to the impact strategy that you wanted to achieve. But it is a very common way of reporting, and it's a common language, I think, for many investors. So it's often that we map the KPIs to these SDGs.
Is it an internal developed KPIs, or how do you come up with the framework?
We just took the indicators. You know, you have 17 SDGs, but below each SDGs you have some, you know, more the small letters, and then other indicators. Now, you have to bear in mind that the SDGs were not really developed for companies. They were more, you know, for governments, etc. So there are some that we need to translate. But more or less what we did was just a mapping. Okay, this is how, what the SDG aims to achieve, and then also, you know, against what KPIs we can collect and where they would fit, no? And also some criteria behind, no? So if then goes, let's take the gender example, no? So what does it, when can you claim SDG 5, no? So then we just also try to follow what is best market standards and have a minimum percentage, for example, of the end beneficiaries that need to be women to be able to claim that SDG. So it's very complex and there's a lot of detail behind, but it's just, I think, a way to claim in a very responsible way what SDGs you are contributing to.
Yeah, if maybe I could add to that, I fully agree with what Veronica said. I guess I would also caution about two things. I think the first one is that the SDGs have become this beautiful communications framework that many of us use in conversations with investors because they sort of help us speak the same language. But I think all those of us that actually work in the depth of impact investing, we all agree that there's certain limitations behind SDG mapping and what we can do. And think, you know, one of those being as an underlying targets not essentially developed for private investment is one of those, right? So one of the better practices we see, I think, across impact reporting of the managers we work with is not only mapping to a certain SDG and trying to come up with, I don't know, a revenue mapping or some other kind of indicator or threshold, but also trying to really articulate within the theory of change or within the impact thesis which target is directly addressed. Maybe just to illustrate as an example, gender equality, right? So there is an underlying target on gender equality, don't quote me which one it was, but there is one, for instance, that relates to infrastructure, right? And access to information, etc. What we have seen from some managers is a range of telecom companies being now linked to SDG 5, which, don't get me wrong, maybe some of them could be, right? It really depends on what the telecom is doing. But I wouldn't, so even the underlying target mapping, I would still try to be very articulate about it in the impact thesis in order to really show an investor why is it that you think that particular telecom helps with gender equality in that regard.
Contribution needs to be purposeful. I mean, impact investing is about making an investment with one strategy, with one intent. I mean, clearly you can have other businesses, but I mean, the way we see this is that we have to link and have a strategy at the beginning with what intended SDGs you try to achieve, because this is what we will manage, in fact. I mean, if we claim an SDG, we will collect the KPIs on a regular basis towards that SDGs. We will have projections on when, you know, on the day we made an investment, how we expect to be, you know, a maturity, for example. And so we need to then measure, you know, the evolution on how we are progressing toward achieving these projections. So I think it's important to it's better sometimes, you know, to focus on a few rather than having and being too ambitious and not really managing this properly.
Yeah, especially because everything is interlinked, right? That's also a bit the purpose of the SDGs, that you don't look at things in silos anymore, but have a bit of a more systemic view. We also use the SDG targets in our due diligence when we check for alignment with our strategy. We say at least it has to contribute to one specific target, not just the big icons. But then again, in reporting, as Veronica said, this translation can be quite difficult with private businesses. It's sometimes just not the right indicators, or they're not specific enough. So it's really more about having a common language to talk about sustainability or impact, also to broaden the scope of what it all entails, right? Maybe 10 years ago when people talked about impact, it was about the environment, and now we have a lot of other topics thanks to the SDGs on everybody's agenda. So in that sense, it's super helpful, but with reporting. We also try to work with an external data provider that kind of models our contribution to the different SDGs based on an AI tool, etc. You can all do that. There's sometimes interesting outcomes, but yeah, I'm not sure if it probably doesn't replace all the bottom-up work that we do anyways. So.
Great question. That got a good conversation going. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thanks. Joseph Naim from Calmus Capital. We've spoken about the what, how, who, and why of measuring impact, but the when is something that can make a big difference between some of the types of companies. So even if it's catalytic impact, how do you differentiate between the additionality at a certain stage of investments when it's a growth company that is helping them directly and therefore it is additional to go to 5, 10, 15 countries and the metrics are just amplified and it looks like there's massive impact there as opposed to what could be seen as catalytic capital because without the first debt that came in, that company would not exist. That's a different existential type of impact. The first company, the first investor or the first few investors in the first round of seed investments is different than everyone coming into a VC and fighting to get in once it's a proven concept, or a company that has massive impact that might be going bankrupt, who provides the debt that allows the company to survive. Surely there must be a metric that differentiates catalytic at an early stage versus existential, without which it would not exist full stop. How do you go about doing that? And I suspect that would be something where across the panel, the types of underlying companies that you finance would have a huge number of them, from Blue Orchid to the types of companies, to the types of funds that larger wealth managers would need as minimum size to be able to access in the first place. So, and when you certify them, how would you differentiate to allow the existential ones to get the necessary financing before everyone else can sort of help it grow? Thank you.
Great question.
I can very briefly try to respond. It's a very interesting question, and it's a very interesting point. And I think I would say it's all about the context that somehow we discussed. So if a product, for example, if you're being completely innovative on a need that is really persistent, in a vulnerable population, for example, I think the potential impact is much, much higher because this doesn't exist. So in our sort of impact assessment that we do, this gives a lot more value. I mean, it's one thing to, we have an example is providing protection to low and vulnerable populations with against negative climate events. And this doesn't exist. I mean, people are in many developing countries are not insured and the products don't exist. So whenever we make this investment, we're being very innovative. So, and this gives, the potential impact is much, much higher. Now, on the other hand, something that we have discussed and touched upon in the panel as well is the impact risks. If you are making something that's completely new, you also need to consider that this might not, the risks of this not materializing are higher, no? So, you need to somehow evaluate and make this assessment towards these two things. I agree that if you're providing something that doesn't exist and the need is really present, I think the potential impact is much higher, but there are risks associated to it as well as with anything.
And a related point is when we invest in businesses that really have the potential to change the whole industry, right? Then we're typically a bit more tolerant when we look at these KPIs because we also see the systemic impact that they could have. We invested in a really interesting business in Sweden that came up with an innovative product that really had the potential to change how everybody else in the industry was doing it too. And then at the beginning, the revenue from this specific product was quite small. So you could say, it's not enough to count as an impact investment. But then we said, no, look, this is going to grow over time. It's more of a transition story, and it's going to influence how the industry as such operates. Again, with the risks, as you mentioned, the risk is higher that this impact that we think is going to happen is not going to materialize. But we also think about this perspective. And then of course, you have the different stages. We at LGT Capital Partners are more focused on late stage growth, buyout. You know, you have established companies, but a similar discussion we had with regards to ESG KPIs. And in our VC business, we also very much push to consider ESG KPIs, even though this is not really common practice yet in the VC industry, because we think if you don't do it early, as the company scales, it will be very difficult to then come later and say, now you also have to think about diversity and you have to think about cyber risks and whatnot. And you see it with some of the unicorns, no? They say, in the beginning we just need to grow and develop our business, but then they're unicorns and they have all kinds of ESG problems, and then it's almost too late to kind of get a hold of them. So maybe not directly answering your question, but it's also a thought that or a topic that we're discussing internally.
It's interesting, right? It's like we're looking at investor contribution as how we would think about risk return in any kind of investment case, right? So I guess if you're willing to take higher risk of impact not occurring and you're willing to tolerate that, you would hope for a big bang and a big impact return at the end, right? So you go earlier stage. I guess it's a very different story if we're talking about public companies, right? So shareholder engagement being one good example where obviously the way we would think of investor additionality is no longer in capital terms, right? Here we're thinking about engagement and the, whether that can actually materialize in actual change down the road. Maybe one thing I fully agree with what the other panelists said. One thing I would still say is that just because the realization of impact is still many years from now, and I gave the example of a biotech company, but it can be anything else that's early stage, right? So we don't really know what the impact outcome is a decade from now. I still think we all agree we need to have milestones and we need to have a logic model, right, of how we're going to get there. And then touch points on those logic model every year, every 2 years, whatever makes sense is a cadence to understand whether we're still on track. Because I think one of the conversations sometimes we have with managers that invest earlier stage is exactly that, in the sense that they say, well, right now I don't know what's going to happen. But if you have a theory of change, if you have a logic model, if you have touch points, yes, there's some things that will be out of your control, but at least you know if you're on track. So I'd still say that's important.
Great. And I might just add from the perspective of verifying all these different types of investors, and this is a learning as much from our impact management practice verifications as reporting, that there isn't kind of one approach to impact that's the most impactful, but what we look for and what I see as kind of advanced practice amongst investors is when they're extremely self-aware. So really, and this is actually not very common still, but really advanced investors are good at articulating their own role in the system they're trying to shift. So understanding the capital that they have, the risk appetite they have, et cetera, and how that can be particularly brought to bear on the social or environmental challenge that they're trying to address. And I think that's really important, and being able to put yourself in the logic model, being able to say what we have available is catalytic capital and that's needed in this particular industry in this way, or what we have is actually the ability to help things scale and come in at a growth stage. Being very clear about that is really being part of defining a good impact strategy up front, and then that lays the foundation for strong reporting. So I think you can be anywhere in that spectrum as long as you know where you are in the spectrum. Other questions? No? All right. Well, I might just ask you all for final thoughts before we wrap up. Maybe just in terms of what you'd like to see the industry do better on impact reporting, kind of your call to action before we go.
I'll start briefly. I think we would like to see more transparency. I think the industry needs to avoid this negative press in the sense of impact washing. So I think increased transparency of what you're doing and how you're reporting back. I think it's important. Having said that, also, I think this balance between, how many resources you put just writing reports towards actually doing impact, it's also important to bear in mind when we discuss this.
Yeah, very similar thoughts. Be more transparent. Don't just boil everything down in a number of lives touched or whatever metrics that you sometimes see, and really add this qualitative context that's super important to understand what these businesses do, because otherwise it's just numbers and nobody can do anything with them. So.
Yeah, and I will maybe just add my call to action will be for even more, I guess, collaboration across the industry on what makes for a good report. I think Blumar has done a great job in getting us into a framework mode. But also I personally think an impact report as such probably wouldn't be or shouldn't be a competitive differentiator for one fund manager over another. I think that is probably one place where we can all come to terms in terms of, this is what we think best practice is. This is how transparent we want to be. This is what we can learn from each other. This is how we can be very open with each other in terms of the struggles we have or the things that we've learned on things that work. And then I think if we have that, then of course we let the underlying impact strategy shine, essentially, right? And that's what the differentiator is. But I think on reporting, my call to action will be to be a lot more open within the industry and actually work together on some of those parameters, because I think that will be tremendous help also for all the investors down the line.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. Well, I hope you all have found this useful. We'll wrap up a bit early, but if anyone does have questions for the panelists, feel free to stick around and come up and talk to us. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. We are now going on a 1 hour and a half lunch break in the village. And the next session recommences at 2 p.m. You still can check the BB Connect app to see the full schedule and pick up your next session. Thank you.
Hello there, and welcome to the exciting world of HIP. This is a new departure in language instruction. For English-speaking people who want to talk to and be understood by jazz musicians,